My name is Dale Wiseman. I'm a Norwich resident and was born in Norwich. And apparently, I've got a Norwich accent, not a Norfolk accent. So take your choice on that one. I attended the UEA in 2012 and done a history degree and finished in 2017. And that changed my whole life and aspect of what I wanted to do and the things that I enjoy. And that's probably led me here today to being to talking about several subjects that I enjoy, including the hospital. So I'm going to start off today. The first time I saw this imposing building, St Andrews, once visited, never forgotten. The first time I saw this imposing building with its light stone brickwork, imposing gates, staff in white coats, doors being locked, and the smell of disinfectant, I was not fazed at all. And I worked there for 6 months, and the mere thought that I could leave at any time of my own free will never crossed my mind. And I never considered that before my time that many hundreds of men and women who did not have that ease of life or choice about their visits to this imposing place. My focus today will feature the start of the asylum through to the farewell service in 1998. From my first visit to the hospital in 1979, which is a long time ago, to visits that I still make today, this is a very special place. And the title that I've selected today reflects my thoughts and possibly some of you here today, and reflects the story that I will end on today, called Once Visited, Never Forgotten. My aim is to trace the many changes, to find out about some of the truly excellent staff who worked here, some of the patients who stayed here, and try to evaluate the impact on those who passed through the gates, whether we worked there, whether we visited, whether we were a patient here, or whether we now have the distinct pleasure of calling this site our family home. From the first drawings of the buildings, with rows and rows of individual cells, with fixed chains to thick walls, it had to change, and it did. The arrival of hundreds of injured young men returning from the fields of France and Belgium, it had to change, and it did. The use of the words asylum and lunatics had to change, and it did. Up to the end of the hospital days and the conversion to residential development, it had to change, and it did. The first mention of a building was on the 11th of October 1808 at the Norfolk Quarter Sessions, and this is a very long title. An Act of Parliament was entitled An Act for the Better Care and Maintenance of Lunatics, being paupers or criminals in England. Just prior to this date, Thorpe St Andrew had a population of 409, and that included Thorpe Hamlet at that point. 100 years later, Thorpe Hamlet was its own area, but we had gained the asylum. So in 1901, the population rose to 2,424, including 76 officials, their families, and 841 inmates at the asylum. So it just goes to show at that period how important it was on the edge of Thorpe, but how important the actual site was and how many people were involved in the process of the asylum. It was opened on the 29th of May 1814 at a cost of 35,000, a year before the Battle of Waterloo, and was only the second in this country after Bedford, and that had opened in 1812 but was closed by 1860. There was a master and a matron with a staff of 10, and they were called keepers. The very first master was Thomas Carroll, who was a gentleman of St Stephen's Street in Norwich. He was appointed in 1813 with his wife Sarah, and they became the first master and matron of the new asylum in Thorpe. Their family of 4 boys and 2 girls moved into their new accommodation at the asylum in preparation for the first intake of patients in May 1814. Now, when I said new accommodation, I didn't mean a separate block or a house or whatever. They'd have been part of the hospital. They'd have been next to a wing of the hospital. So I'm sure it wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. A great source of research for us, for Thomas, is his journal, his master's, the original master's journals, which are held here at the record office. The Carrolls would have had to deal with the death of inpatients, minister to the elderly and confused, and those who had been dealt debilitating blows to their mental health. A couple of examples in his entries read, on the 8th of January 1816, Mr. Stracey, chairman of the Asylum Committee, visited the asylum and made a very strict inquiry to know how I acted with regard to the noisy and dirty patients complained of by Mr. Dalrymple. All sounds very like Charles Dickens, doesn't it? I informed the chairman that I adopted the plan of taking the first I found making a noise, put him or her to a cell, and found out that this had the desired effect on the other patients. So we're right at the start of the asylum. It's very basic stuff, but this is what Thomas Carroll was having to deal with. The 27th of March 1816, Thomas Cook became violent and throwing of stones, by which means he broke one of my windows in my sitting room. The time I was in the room writing, I therefore ordered him to bed as punishment. The master and matron were thought of as compassionate and caring people, and provided the best care they could. During the early years of their tenure, they would only have had methods of their time to use for patient treatment, some of which we would find unacceptable today. For example, chains securing the very unruly patient to the chair or bed, and also the use of straitjackets. There were limited medication options to be used. Often patients were given iron pills, purging medicine, and port wine as their treatment, but not necessary at the same time. Mrs. Carroll gave birth in 1814 to a fifth son called William, and it is interesting that they chose the middle name of Asylum. This was obviously in honour of his place of birth, and he was the only one of their children born at St Andrews. He was baptised at Thorpe Parish Church at the same time as some of the other children, some of whom had already been baptised at St Stephen's earlier. They obviously thought it better to get it done twice than not at all. This completed the family, and older daughters would have helped in the asylum, in particular Elizabeth, who became a valued assistant for a time and stepped in as a temporary matron during her mother's illness. She remained single and looked after her father in later life. William Asylum Carroll would go on to become a surgeon, and he spent many years working in Charlton in Kent at their hospital. So it obviously doesn't sound as if it stopped him in his tracks. Thomas Carroll had begun his 29th year as a master at Norfolk Lunatic Asylum when the justices advertised for a new appointment in February 1843. Their decision, prompted by Carroll's ill health and advancing years, also reflected plans to extend the asylum. The job was advertised for an unmarried man, aged under 45 years, able to read and do documents. The man who answered these terms was Ebenezer Owen, who was offered the post on the 24th of April 1843. He was offered a provisional salary of £100 with board and lodging, raised to £150 in August 1844 when Thomas Carroll died and therefore ceased to draw his pension. So Mr. Owen had to wait until Mr. Carroll died before he got pay rise, or probably what was his appropriate wage. Now, one of the things that, and this is again, today there'll be a lot of connections to the Norfolk Record Office. We're here, which is brilliant. And another thing that the Norfolk Record Office about 6 years ago, they had a project which lined up with a project called Change Minds. And some of you might know about this. This was started about 8 years ago and is a transformative archival adventure for people from North Norfolk and Norwich who live with current mental health conditions. And I've been tracking and participating in this project during this period. And through this group, I've been able to research several of the asylum patients from the 1880s. I've selected 2 of these patients, one a short-term patient and the second a long-term patient. The first is this lady here called Hannah Chatton. This is her page from the case books previously mentioned. Honor was born in 1825 in Brockdish. She would go on to have a family of 9 children. By the time she entered the asylum, Honor was a widow. On her admission on the 16th of December 1882, she was aged 57. And that is her admission photograph, the one on the left. And she's aged 57. The photo on the left is that entrance photo. And at the time, her weight was 6 stone 6 pounds. And she could not read or write and had been working as a domestic servant. On her entry form, it appears that about 3 weeks prior to admission, she became low-spirited and fancied that she was going to die. She asserts that she has temptation to do away with herself. She is depressed and miserable and sees herself as a wicked woman for no apparent reason. 2 months into her stay, she is not sleeping well, but showing some improvement during the daytime. By the 7th of March, it was noted that her mood is cheerful and she does not give expressions to delusions. Her mood improved over the rest of March, and at the end of March, she is deemed as recovered and is cheerful and industrious. Now, the word recovered, if you come here, if you look at the record books, someone has gone across the bottom of these pages when the patients are released and put recovered. And as we know today, that word just doesn't fit in with what is going on and what was going on at the time. But that's easy to say with hindsight. Now, the picture on the right is her exit photograph. Now, in some of these journals, two great big books, you have an entry and an exit photograph. Now, with Honor, we have both, which is absolutely, for us historians and trying to understand what is going on, that is absolutely fantastic. The photo on the right records, or the wording on the right records, that she weighed 7 stone 6 pounds when she came out about 4 months later. So as an overview, we see that Honor was only in the asylum for about 4 months, but her mood had improved, her weight had been increased, and she appears to have been deemed well enough to go back to her family after a bout of what we might call today mild depression. Records show that Honor lived to the decent age of 72, and we cannot find any record of her returning to the asylum. Now, as I said earlier, the Change Minds projects is people today doing observation, all kinds of things to do with these records from the 1880s. And the young lady who looked at Honor did this lovely poem that I will read out because it's just a real piece as far as I'm concerned, and it really gives us a good aspect of probably an interpretation of what might have been going on for Honor at the time. So the poem is called Wicked. Wicked being tired of life, wicked not wanting to die, too wicked to lie, too wicked to die. I sold myself to Satan. I sold too wicked to eat, too wicked to sleep. I sit and stare. I used to pray. I sit and stare. I used to hope. I sit and stare. God giveth and he taketh away. He gives you a soul and then he breaks it apart. I'm told it's his to take. It isn't mine to sell. Wicked. So I thought that was a lovely interpretation of something that is now previously with Honor's photographs, it was the photograph that drew me in, and I thought there must be a story there. And then when I saw this picture of a young, desperate-looking chap, Frederick Winnels, again I was drawn in, and I thought there must be a story. There must be a backdrop to this. And in my opinion, this picture shows a stark, scared young man. Frederick was born in 1858, and when he was admitted in 1883, his brother was also a patient at in St Andrews by then. Frederick was only 25 at the time, having spent the previous 5 years at Higham Hall Asylum. Frederick's records show that he was never capable of education due to his naturally feeble capacity of his mind. And there is strong evidence that there is a family trait of mental illness within the male side. Frederick had been diagnosed as epileptic, and violence had followed him during his time at Higham. On admission, he has a dull, stupid, idiotic expression, but answers simple questions. Within 3 days of admission, he is recorded as tearing up vines and shrubs in the garden and threatening another patient. His long records show that he stayed in the asylum as a long-term patient. He goes from times of quiet to times of violence and periods of illness. He would live out the rest of his life at the asylum, with his death recorded as in 1908. So in his short life of 50 years, he is recorded as being in detention for at least 30 of those. So the photograph you see is the entry photograph, because obviously he never came out, so we don't have an exit photograph, do we? Now, this is another character who's a big important character in the St. Andrews story. In November 1861, after a series of interviews and a short list of 6, William C. Hills was offered the role of medical officer after serving 7 years at the Kent County Asylum. Now, if you remember back to Mr. Carroll, he was more of a clerical person. Dr. Hills became the first medical person to be invited to be in charge of the hospitals or the asylum. So we are now looking at a really big change in all aspects. William Hills was born in 1828 at Guy's Hospital. As the new broom, Dr. Hills immediately drew the committee of visitors' attention to the overcrowded state of the asylum, and he repeated these thoughts until a move was made to build a new auxiliary building in the asylum. During his time, the population of the asylum doubled. In addition to his medical duties, Dr. Hills was responsible for the administration of the lunacy law regulations, the overseeing of staff and tradesmen, and the maintenance of the asylum generally. So he's literally in charge of everything. Up here at the record office, we have his journals, or some of his journals. So again, a lot of information you're now going to hear is from those. And his journals detail matters as diverse as the patient's deaths, outbreaks of contagious diseases, occasional fires, and issues with drains. The latter, being antiquated and poorly installed, proved particularly vexing. We've got these days and weeks of journals, observations, and at the end, he generally finishes on the latest drain problem, which for someone from a medical background must be very, just generally hard work, mustn't it? He implemented the substitution of water and tea for beer, except for individuals and those doing strenuous labour, obviously on health grounds. Admittingly, this measure also saved money, but Dr. Hills records that this change resulted in patients they had a better appetite, and in any case, no one seemed to notice the difference. Don't quite understand where that's coming from, but another concept of improvement to be seen during Hill's time was that of the time the patients would have been actively employed in the day-to-day running of the asylum. Now, as asylum's getting bigger, more patients, more extensions, more buildings, it literally by 1900 the asylum became its own little village, as we'll call it. They were growing food, they had a proper farm, they had an abattoir, they had boiler rooms. And what happened, Dr. Hill started to get the patients to do some of the work. Records show that a healthy rate of involvement of patients in many areas, including farm work, kitchen, stables, and the shoemaker's shop. Dr. Hills was a firm but fair employer. Dereliction of duty, sustained impotence, and particularly ill treatment of patients was punished with dismissal. In one case, having heard that a male attendant had been physically abusing his partner, he fully investigated the matter, and having found the accusation to be sustained, dismissed the male attendant, notwithstanding his previous service as an army sergeant with 3 good conduct badges. So Dr. Hill spends a lot of time with the patients. He's putting the patients first, it appears. Dr. Hills was married twice, the first time to Diana in 1854 while at Kent Asylum, and Diana would go on to be the matron in Thorpe until her sudden death in 1867. Dr. Hills remarried. He married Catherine in 1869, and they had two children, Monson and Katie. Katie would go on to be a member of the Norwich Board of Guardians, as well as being one of the first justices of peace for the city of Norwich. By the start of 1886, Dr. Hills had served 32 years in asylums, for which almost 25 years at Thorpe. This was an incredibly lengthy period for a lunatic doctor. A parliamentary select committee had, in 1860, highlighted that the duties of a medical officer in a lunatic asylum were so peculiar and such painful consequences are known to result from incessant intercourse with the various forms of this distressing disease. So at the front line, it is hell of a stressful job. That the pensionable service should be reduced from 20 years to 15. Indeed, of 15 medical officers employed at the Norfolk Asylum between 1854 and 1887, 6 died in their 30s and 40s. The remainder, bar a couple of hardy souls, either sought refuge in general practice or the Army Medical Service. In February 1886, Dr. Hill's son Monson, only aged 16, died whilst at private school. During the year, there were also 3 suicides at the asylum. The third in October was of a patient who was described in the patient's casebook as being attached to Dr. Hills. And by Dr. Hills himself, he called him his walking companion. Whether this death was the final straw is arguable, but a month later, Dr. Hills filed his letter of resignation. Now, this is an imposing picture of the gates and stuff around about 1901, just prior to where we're just now heading. So it's an imposing building, isn't it? With the gates and the guards and everything. Dr. Hills retired to Thorpe St Andrew, where he subsequently elected as one of Thorpe's first parish councillors in 1895, and he served as vice chairman of that council. His obituary in the British Medical Journal states that he spent his remaining years as a consultant and working in medical work amongst the poor of the district. He also maintained his close involvement with mental diseases and generally spent a few weeks each summer at the City of London Asylum. In 1898, his ill health prompted him to move with his daughter Katie in Norwich, moved in with her in Norwich. Dr. Hills died in 1902 and he's buried at All Saints Churchyard in Poswick. So it's a lovely story. Living in Kent, the family move up, the family stay here. Dr. Hills stayed here, his daughter carried on and lived here. So it's a lovely story of moving across and moving to people moving to Norfolk and staying here, which I'm sure many of us have done. Now, the person who took over from him was a chap called Dr. David Thomson, and his arrival broadly coincided with the altered asylum management under the 1880 and 1890 Acts, which he used to his advantage. His main innovation was to undo Hill's approach and expand the asylum on 2 sites on the basis of sexual segregation. Now, up to this point, we only had the south site. The men and women were all on the south site. As soon as Dr. Thomson comes in, he looks at the principle of having split wards and split buildings. And by 1901, the north site was built, and that then became the men's ward, and the ladies' ward stayed as the south site. So Dr. Thomson's big move within 5 or 10 years of him being there was sexual segregation. By 1914, considerable improvements to the asylum environment coincided with the usage of the word hospital long before its requirement under the 1930 Mental Health Act. Now, basically, we're still talking about asylums, but Dr. Thomson sees a point where we need to go from asylums to hospitals. While researching Dr. Thomson, I came out, this is Dr. Thomson in the middle with his nice bowler hat on. I came across this story which connects him to the famous Sherlock Holmes stories of this period. Thomson studied at Edinburgh University, and one of his fellow students there was Arthur Conan Doyle, who would later go on to forge himself a very good career as a writer of some esteem. The two men kept in touch and were very good friends through their love of science, medicine, photography, and a strong love of several sports, of which cricket was at the top of the list. Both men were very strong cricketers, and it was no surprise that Conan Doyle, on one of his many visits to Norfolk, ended up playing cricket with his friend David Thomson. They appear on several scorecards for St Andrew's Cricket Club, who are one of the longest surviving clubs in Norfolk, and they're still running today. The pair also played for hospital teams. The club's home pitch, up until the 1980s, was on the north side of the Asylum, just in front of the large wing there. And here it is today, which is it hasn't been made into a car park yet, but I'm sure that's about the only use that will ever happen. So now both men were strong cricketers, and it was no surprise. Yeah, sorry, I've done that. On the scoreboards in 1891, they show that Doyle has performed well against Lowestoft and the 8th Hussars. In another game versus Lowestoft in 1894, Doyle hit 65 and Thomson was out for a duck. A match report for a game between Dr. Thomson's 11 and Dr. Law's team goes on to say that Doyle's bowling was simply unplayable. Doyle did actually, I think he made 2 appearances for the MCC, so he was a very good cricketer. In the second innings, he took a hat-trick and finishing with 8 wickets for the loss of 9 runs. Now, if you know your cricket, that is quite good going. One report reads that Conan Doyle is a good cricketer, and we have ample proof for on his occasional performances at the county asylum in recent years have been full of merit. Now, in the book I showed a minute ago, the author Booth states that a candidate for whom Doyle based his Sherlock Holmes famous sidekick Dr. Watson could be partly based on his good friend Thomson. Doyle is quoted as saying that the character of Watson is partly written through his experiences of working under Joseph Bell, who also supervised Thomson in their earlier years. Booth also goes on to say that when Thomson was eventually made superintendent at the county asylum in Norwich, where Conan Doyle often visited him, according to another asylum doctor, Conan Doyle once asked Thomson what he thought of Watson. When Thomson replied negatively, Conan Doyle is alleged to have said, "I'm sorry you think that. I rather modelled him on you." And as we go back, what do you think of that? So whether or not it's 100% accurate, but that's a lovely story. By the time of the outbreak of the First World War, the hospital was seen as being in a very good place. And Dr. Thomson had been in his role at the asylum for 28 years. So forget what I said from 1860, 20 years, all that kind of thing. He's still here after 28 years. This progressive vein was disrupted by the Great War, which resulted in the evacuation of a considerable number of the existing patients and the physical conversion of the asylum into a military hospital under the War Office. Key personnel. So as you know, as with much else in civilian life in 1914-15, the running of the asylums was initially regarded as a matter of business as usual. Dr. Thomson was among the senior medical superintendents who met with the Border Control to consider the new arrangements on the 1st and the 8th of February 1915. Very little time was wasted, and by the 1st of March, the War Office triggered the evacuation and conversion plans. Stephen Cherry writes that the conversion of the physical fabric of the hospital included the immediate removal of obvious asylum features such as door and window locks and padded cells, the widening of corridors and doorways to accommodate stretcher parties, and the installation of lifts. Some 1,050 beds were available, which was a lot less than the War Office envisaged. War Office space had to be distributed around the site, encroaching upon valuable ward space. Now, when I said earlier about some things stay the same, a lot of the patients, there was a general division. If a patient was handy, if a patient was working on the farm, if a patient could do a job, they were retained. If a patient was in a poor way or wasn't going to be any use to the War Office, they were shipped off to Helston Hospital to stay in a ward and that. But if they had a use, there was a percentage of people patients were retained. So you can imagine trying to grow food and do stuff. As the slide shows, all the pink areas, see a couple there, all the pink areas are the additions that I mentioned a moment ago. In this area, just outside the main entrance, as we call it now, that included 5 operating bays. All the operation areas were right outside the front, 2 X-ray rooms and a large waiting room. New complete wards were added onto the bottom end of south site, and there were new wards added on the north site. This is a picture from the north site, and these are the temporary things that we're talking about. They're not they are temporary buildings, but they're fairly substantial, sort of quite robust tents, and these became the wards, and as you can see the numbers on them, 9, 10, 11 or whatever. Dr. Thomson now became officing commander and administrator at the hospital, so he's got 2 roles. He retained the day-to-day control of the enlarged hospital staff, but although he maintained his links with the Asylum Committee of Visitors and the Board of Control, he was ultimately responsible to the War Office. So he's now got 2 bosses. The chance of this change of use also saw a new intake of nurses with a different set of skills to the current batch. The reorganisation of nursing posed many problems, for the War Hospital required a greatly increased staff at a time when the shortage of trained nurses was acute. There were particular problems for the former asylum nurses, many of whom were trained and certified as mental health nurses and inexperienced in nursing bodily ailments, but not qualified as general nurses, and therefore they were retained on probationary grades at lower pay, often on wards where they had formerly been in charge. So you can see there's a shift, not a good shift. Obviously, new staff, if possible, was brought in, or medically trained staff. Now, one of the new medically trained staff is this lady here. And again, as I said before about the patients, it was this photograph, again, that drew me in. It's a lovely photograph. You're probably going to guess which country this lady came from. One such medical nurse was Annie Park Kerr. It was a 24-year-old born in Sutherland in Scotland. Her starting date was recorded as the 3rd of November 1915. She started out as a probation nurse with her wages as £20 per annum. Records show that she was at our war hospital all through the Great War. The second picture has been identified as from the period at St Andrews, but the young lad looks too young to have been involved in World War I, or was he? We don't know. We don't know the facts, but you know, as when we go back to World War I, some of the recruits were only 14, 15, and 16. So Annie is then listed as a staff nurse at the Ross Memorial Hospital in Dingwall in London in 1926. Her next recorded move was to enlist as a member of the nursing service in the Merchant Navy. This would lead her to be on the SS Ceramic in 1942, which was being used as a military hospital boat. So she spent all 4 years at St Andrews. She's now in the Second World War. She's joined the Merchant Navy. She's on a military hospital boat. The boat was carrying 656 people and sailing across the Atlantic from Liverpool to Australia when tragedy struck overnight on December the 6th, 1942. SS Ceramic was controversially torpedoed by a German U-boat, and on board that day were 264 crew, 14 gunners, 244 military and naval personnel, 133 fare-paying passengers, including 12 children. There was only 1 survivor. Now, one of the unusual consequences of Annie Parker is that she is commemorated on 3 memorials in 3 different places. Now, if you know a little bit about military history, that is quite unusual. Her name is on a newly restored memorial in Alness in Scotland, her last known address, a second one in Loch-in-Avern, and one in Tower Hill, London. She was awarded the 39-45 star, the Atlantic Star, the Pacific Star, the War Medal 39-45, and the British Red Cross Medal for war service in between 14 and 18 at St Andrews. Her niece remembers her aunt as a hardy character who was dedicated to her job. And I think her photograph tells me all I need to know about that. Now, records show that 44,651 patients were treated at the Norfolk War Hospital, and almost 90% of them were admitted after evacuation to England, and 419 of them died there of their wounds. Now, one of the items that I came across at the record office, again, sorry to keep flicking over to the record office, was this catalogue dated the 3rd of November 1919. And this shows that there was a massive sale of all kinds of stock and equipment that was used at the hospital during the war years. The sale was from the Ministry of Munitions by order of the Disposal Board and would last 3 days. In the inside page of this brochure, it states that the sale will commence every day at 10 a.m. through to 4 p.m. All used bedding and linen has been thoroughly sterilised and washed, which I'm sure we're all pleased about. On the viewing days, the public will be directed through the wards on production of the main catalogue at the main entrance. Now, this is the best bit. Special buses have been laid on from Foundry Bridge, and there is a frequent train service from Norwich Thorpe Station. So it's a right big occasion for the city, isn't it? The hospital is selling up stuff. On the pages shown, we've seen that some of the items are from wards J and K, and these include 15 spare bed heads, 385 pillows, 715 feather pillows, 22 inkwells, 3 paper baskets, and 1 green painted table. 18 milk jugs and 53 hanging mirrors. The list is endless. There were over 1,480 items listed. Now, I first thought when I saw this, why wasn't the stuff kept for the hospital if there's going to be a hospital as we go forward? But when I went into it a little bit deeper, all of the stuff was literally from the temporary wards. So all the temporary wards came down, all the stuff. Plus, I suppose, as governmental, it was a point of getting some money back, wasn't it? Getting some much needed funds in. After the chaos of World War I, the hospital moved into a new groove. Dr. Thomson had suggested the term mental hospital as far back as 1910, and finally in 1920 it was renamed the Norfolk Mental Hospital. So we lose the word asylum. Peace was not to last long, as we all know, and at the outbreak of World War II, St Andrews again played a similar role as 20 years earlier. The problems to bear to be on a larger scale, but all in all, St Andrews certainly played its role in the war effort. Now, as we came out of World War II, in 1965, St Andrews became one of the 5 hospitals within the enlarged 8, which was controlled by an unwieldy 29-member bi-monthly committee. It's starting to get complicated now. Certain sectors started to be centralised, including a new nurse training school at Helsden. More laboratory work went to the Norfolk and Norwich. Thereby, so much needed investment started to pitter away from St Andrews. The rundown pending eventual closure of St Andrews can be traced back to these kind of political decisions. And also there are patient records that show a large number of patients were discharged at the beginning of the 1970s. Records show that for 1971, for example, there was a sharp reduction in usage of beds from 925 to 561. Now, I found this advert. I was given a copy of this advert by someone in Thorpe, and I just found it quite interesting just to have a look at that time frame. And it tells us that St Andrews is a happy place to work for all grades of nursing staff, who all derive great satisfaction from following a career which helps to restore people to health and happiness. That's a lovely little piece. The top picture was a little, I'm sure there's a different explanation for this, because it shows a well turned out lady with a full Sunday best tea set on an ornate tray in the mental health hospital. The third picture shows a bed change practice with an odd looking doll, as the patient even looks as the doll even looks like he's had makeup has been applied. So I thought the rest of the leaflet was fine, but I just found them pictures a little bit unsettling. I hope you haven't, to be fair. But the bed numbers at St Andrews, again, as I say, were reducing, and by 1974 through to 1980, Thorpe St Andrew became the slightly forgotten. It became more of a rest home, and 80% of those who died at St Andrews over a 10-year period had no actual other address. So it became a point of people ending their lives at St Andrews rather than being an ongoing hospital, as we'd like to say. And when we compare this to the 1880s, as I mentioned earlier, a large majority of the early case studies show the patients as being short-term, maybe as little as 4 months, like Honor, and then returning to their families and carrying on working. But as we go through the 1970s, the 1980s, people stayed in Thorpe for a long time unless they died or they went into a care home. Now, the last North Site ward was closed in 1993, leading to a reduction of staff needed. Interestingly, St Andrews was still being used as a model hospital, but more patients were now being delegated to Helston. And the final push away from St Andrews was the building of the St Julian Hospital in 1996, which offered 3 wards, offering 100 short stay beds in single or shared rooms, and a 30-place day centre and an outpatient clinic. So St Andrews, now built in 1814, new buildings built in 1901, it's now an old place. You've now got the new purpose-built places that are taking its place. And in December 1997, the site was placed for sale and the Oxygen Day Centre relocated to the converted Ward 16 at Helston. And the last remaining patients were moved to the Earlham Ward at the West Norwich. The St Andrews farewell service, as you can see on the screen, was held on Sunday, the 15th of March, 1998. It was held in the old chapel and it was attended by 250 well-wishers. Today, the safe site has been converted into this fine-looking housing estate that possibly there's people in here today who live there. The future of the North site is less certain, and I shall just tell you a little bit about that in a moment. As a general conclusion of the talk this afternoon, as you've seen, I'll focus very much on the people who passed through the Asylum Stroke Hospital, starting with the rawness of the stewardship of the Carroll family, where you get the impression that Thomas and Sarah were in at the deep end. The 2 patients' records I've featured have allowed us to be able to try and understand about their entry and exit points at the asylum. And the work of Changed Minds has certainly opened up our knowledge and understanding of what people went into the asylum for and how they came out the other end to return to their families, whilst others were rooted for the rest of their lives in one institution or another. Dr. Hills and Dr. Thomson certainly progressed the treatment and confidence of patients, so as many as possible could return to their families. The First World War changed everything, but St Andrews adjusted and changed it did. The nursing care and solid administration show St Andrews in a good light during a very difficult period. And finally, after all the madness, patience and asylum information, I thought it'd be good to finish on a happy ending. I had a good look through all of the files that I have, and this was my favourite. And this came from a snippet as written by Viv Roberts, and I was able to follow up and piece together the story after the information I was given. In 1918, a Red Cross nurse from Loddon called Margaret Royal treated an Australian soldier called George, who had been wounded in France. They became wartime sweethearts, but eventually went their separate ways. Him back to Australia, and Margaret stayed in Norfolk and married Henry Goodson in Loddon in 1921. They had a son, Harry, in 1921, the same year. In 1969, the Australian man contacted the Eastern Evening News, and they were put in touch again after a period of 52 years. Then in 1971, Henry passed away, the husband, and 5 years later, in 1976, Margaret, at the age of 80, went to Australia and lived out the rest of her life in the outback with her wounded soldier who she had met at the Norfolk War Hospital. Once visited, never forgotten. Thank you.